Okay, I've got to pick up where I left. My tablet did something funny um, with one of my other apps, and so I've got to figure out where it picked up. So I'm gonna start with the history here. And so we talked about the Colombians taking over the market from the Cubans, and then I started talking about the Medellin and the Cali drug cartels. Um, and then I don't know where it shut off. Silly tablet. Demand for cocaine was higher than the supply. So the Medellin cartel, under the control of Pablo Escobar, largely able to reinvest his profits into more sophisticated smuggling methods, thus increasing both his profits and his control over the market. The Medellin cartel's downfall was a direct result, however, of its use of violence, because primarily because they were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of law enforcement and government officials in Colombia, causing them to be a primary target for both U.S. and Colombian law enforcement. And by the early 1990s, most of the cartel leaders had been killed by police. Um, but the Medellin's use of violence also had another effect. It allowed the Cali cartel, which was far more subtle in its operations, to conduct business without much interference from law enforcement. Unlike Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, the Cali tend to use bribery and other forms of corruption rather than violence, and reinvest a lot of its profits into legitimate business. Unfortunately for the Cali, once the Medellin cartels were taken care of, the governments then were able to turn their attention to the Cali, and by 1995, the Cali cartel had been dealt with by law enforcement. As a result, the distribution of cocaine worldwide has become much more decentralized and is operated by numerous smaller organizations operating out of Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. The next drug I want to talk about is heroin. Heroin is produced form of the opium poppy, native to the Mediterranean region of the world. It's planted in late summer or fall. It takes about 3 months to mature, so it's a fairly fast-growing plant. Raw opium is harvested in sitting seed pods with a special knife-like instrument, which exposes it to the air, at which point it turns brown, it dries, and then it's collected the next day. The heroin itself is produced from morphine, which is the active ingredient in raw opium. And there are 4 major sources of heroin worldwide. The first being what's called the Golden Triangle. This is an area of Southeast Asia, really around Thailand, Burma, Laos, and Vietnam. Usually this is produced into an off-white powder called China White, smuggled to the United States in sea shipping containers out of Taiwan and Hong Kong. Tends to be concealed in legitimate goods and then transported to major ports of entry on the west coast of the United States and in Canada. Trade coming out of the Golden Triangle was largely controlled by the Chinese and Asian groups known as the Tongs and the Triads, folks we'll talk about in the upcoming weeks. Chinese Triads operating out of Hong Kong expanded their business into the United States with the help of American-based Chinese Tong. And the Tongs began, basically the way it works is the Triads do the production and the smuggling, and then the Tongs do wholesale distribution. Their distribution network, however, was heavily damaged in 2003 by the Drug Enforcement Agency and Hong Kong law enforcement, who dismantled a group known as the Four Untouchables, who had been responsible for an annual smuggling of about $100 million worth of heroin annually. The second major source of heroin is the Golden Crescent. This is an area around Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkey, and Iran, and is responsible for 92% of the world's supply of heroin. This is heroin that helped finance Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, which is kind of ironic because in 2001 the Taliban actually banned cultivation of opium for religious reasons. Of course, the reality is it was probably just an attempt to raise prices, but it caused a production drop. It went from, in 2000, you saw a production of about 365 metric tons of heroin. In 2001, that dropped to 74 metric tons. In 2002, when the Taliban fell, production resumed. By 2002, you were up to 150 metric tons annually, 337 metric tons in 2003, and 582 metric tons in 2004. And so after the fall of Taliban, you see heroin production is even higher than it was before the Taliban banned it. While opium production is technically banned by the government of Afghanistan, enforcement based on the Civil War and the U.S. war in Afghanistan makes enforcement of it fairly difficult. And then the Afghan heroin usually is sold in Europe and sold through other types of organized crime, notably the Russian organized crime and the Sicilian mafia is heavily involved in heroin sales out of Afghanistan product. Our third major producer is Mexico. Mexican heroin is often very crudely processed, tends to possess a lot of impurities, typically brown or black in color and referred to as black tar. While only 2% of the world's heroin is produced in Mexico, almost all of it is sold and distributed in the United States. And there has been a disturbing trend in that Mexican heroin, the price has been dropping while the quality has been increasing, making it a larger problem for our law enforcement. In Mexico, it is largely grown by independent farmers who are often contracted by a trafficker or an organization who not only pays for their crop, but pays for their equipment and feeds the farmer's family. The largest of these trafficking families was the Herrera family out of Mexico, which is an all-related cartel, which is still doing good business even though their patriarch was arrested in '87. Mexican heroin comes across our border in large amounts in trucks or in small amounts by mules, with Los Angeles being the primary distribution center for Mexican heroin. And then finally, our fourth and final source of heroin is South America. Typically, this is Colombia. We're talking about 5% of the world's heroin. And like Mexico, Colombian heroin is almost exclusively sold in the United States. There really is no dominant trafficking or production organization for heroin in Colombia. And it's usually, trafficking is conducted and production usually by revolutionary guerrilla groups operating in Colombia. South American heroin usually comes by courier or mule aboard commercial flights into Miami, Atlanta, or New York. This is these stories you hear about individuals who swallow heroin in small plastic bags or wrapped in latex, shoved into body cavities. All right, so about heroin, so about marijuana. Marijuana, of course, the most commonly used illegal substance, and its major source is of Mexico. Even when not produced in Mexico, it is most commonly transported across the Mexican border of the United States. And it tends to come in false compartments in vehicles or shipments of legal agricultural products, not cocaine, not coffee. Sometimes even comes under the border. In addition to Mexico, marijuana may also come out of Jamaica and the Bahamas, using the same routes used for transportation of cocaine. And the final thing I want to tell you about marijuana trafficking is that in recent years, we've seen an increase in marijuana trafficking out of Canada. And the Canadians actually use advanced hydroponic techniques. They produce a more potent form of marijuana, higher THC levels. And typically, Canadian marijuana is produced by Vietnamese organized crime and sold by associates of the Hells Angels. And that is my spiel about drug trafficking. And so that's that. Remember, next week is the midterm exam, and we'll be talking about outlaw motorcycle gangs and prison gangs and stuff like that. Okay, bye.